Friends, I pray that everyone is, even at this point, well rested as we sing these songs and worship the Lord and reminded of who God is and His grace. And just real thankful for our praise team to faithfully serve and lead us in worship week in and week out. And if you didn't know, they practice so many hours during the week and they sacrifice and their families sacrifice as well. And so I just want to publicly thank them for just leading us so faithfully into song in God's presence. But if you have your Bibles, we are continuing along in our series in the life of Joseph, Renew and Reconcile. And today we're going to look at chapter 40, a well-known passage in its own right, as Joseph interprets two dreams that have really antithetical outcomes, opposite outcomes. And so if you're able, I want to ask you to please stand as for the reading of God's word. Chapter 40, the entire chapter, verses 1 to 23. So please give your open hearts and minds to the hearing of His word. May we receive what the Lord has in store for us today. Genesis chapter 40, starting with verse 1. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in prison, each his own dream, and each dream with his own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there is the vine before me, and on the vine there are 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. And here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There are 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there are all sorts of baked food from Pharaoh, but the birds are eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast where all his servants lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And this is God's word. Please take your seats. So we've been looking at the story of Joseph, and in chapter 40, we get a picture of Joseph's life that sort of continues along the theme of his suffering. He's in prison, house in prison, and he's in a disappointed state of affairs. He's probably extremely frustrated. He's been there for a long time. And literally in chapter 40, we get to see what life is like in the pits. That's what the chapter is about. He gets thrown into a pit, which is really just house imprisonment, which is Potiphar's house, probably a side room connected to Potiphar's house, but he's in house imprisonment. But the experience of this for Joseph is such that he says, life is the pits. I've been thrown into the pit. And the poor guy hasn't been thrown into the pit just once, but this is at least the 2nd time, because back in chapter 37, he was thrown in the pits by his brother. So he really seems, or at least Moses does, loves to use this word, the pits. Verse 15 of chapter 40 says this, "For indeed I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." And then chapter 37:19, Joseph's brother threw him into a pit. And literally we see here in Joseph's life, Joseph living out this English idiom that life is the pits. Do you know where that English idiom, that phraseology comes from? Well, actually, I Googled it. We don't really know. On the one hand, people say it's a reference to the coal miners back in the day because coal mining was hard work. It's dirty. It's life-threatening. It could lose oxygen. It could cave in. It wasn't a pleasant experience. The other theory is that life in the pits came from just a reference to the armpit. That's really saying that when you feel like life is in the pits, it carries this aroma, this stench that comes from body odor in the pits. So it's very telling that they say New Jersey, where I'm from, is the armpit of America. That's what captures life, according to Joseph chapter 40. Friends, this morning, you may feel that your life is in the pits in some way. And you're thinking, oh, that's so metaphorical. But it is, because that's how Hebrews, or that's how Genesis chapter 40 uses the word pit. It's not literal. That's Joseph's experience. That's what it feels like. And you may feel disappointed here today. You may feel frustrated. You may feel scared or angry. You may feel confused, perhaps depressed because you can't change life or fix things that's going around in your life. All kinds of issues can come around, and it makes it difficult to move on. Life experiences are entirely unique to the individual. The counselor Ed Welch says that no two experiences of suffering are exactly the same, but all suffering shares something in common, that they're generally painful and always lead people to hopelessness. Suffering can make you doubt who God is and that he's a God of love. Suffering and disappointment make you question really the truth of God's word and his promises. But suffering and disappointment, friends, is the world that we live in. I don't need to convince you of that. It's true. It comes to us in so many ways, so many forms, and it seems sometimes relentless. One after the other, we feel like we relive the life of Joseph or the life of Job. And the question comes to us, friends, here this morning, as Christians, believers, how do we remain faithful when we feel that life is in the pits? What are we supposed to do? How can we hold on to our faith and the truth of God's word in this confusing and broken world? How do we make sense of all the frustration and disappointment that we experience? How do we reconcile the brokenness of this world? And we read the Bible that says God is a father who loves you, but how do we reconcile the two? Chapter 40, with Joseph's life in the pits, gives us a couple of pointers in this direction, but ultimately it sets our heart and our eyes and our gaze upon Jesus Christ, to turn our eyes upon Jesus and look full in his wonderful face. And so I want to look at Joseph's life because we can learn a couple of things about how to live life in a broken world that will bring a level of peace and prosperity, a level of security, a level of hope. These are three things that we see in Joseph's life as he serves as for us a model of the Christian life and a disciple. Three things that he does. First, life in the pits, Joseph shows us that he's still compassionate to people. He's compassionate to people. Secondly, he shows himself to be faithful to God. And then thirdly, and ironically, he's forgotten by the important people. And we have to deal with this, with that disappointment. So three things that Joseph shows us is that he's compassionate to people, he's faithful to God, and then he's also okay with being forgotten by important people. So let's look at this because we can apply it to our lives too. So compassionate to people, we see Joseph's compassion in verse 7. He asks the cupbearer and the baker, "Why are your faces downcast today?" Actually, even in verse 6, it says, when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. Now, he's looking for people who are hurting. He saw that they were troubled, and he took the time to ask, "Why are you so downcast today?" A simple question. Some commentators translate it a little bit differently to say, "Why do you look so sad?" Or why do you look so blue? Why do you look so glum? According to one commentator. And you're thinking, that's not really that compassionate. He's just asking a question. But if you look at where Joseph's life is at this point, it's a remarkable sign of compassion and care. It's an extraordinary moment of grace working through the life of Joseph. Why do you look so downcast? One simple question opens up the floodgates of God's grace that moves forward his plan for salvation in Jesus Christ. So let me show you why that is. In verse 1, the author begins and says, sometime after this, after the events of chapter 39, commentators are almost unanimous. Verse 1, sometime after this, means at this point, Joseph has been in prison for about 10 years, at least 10 years, probably a total of 13 when all is said and done. Joseph has been falsely imprisoned for 10 years, and his life at this point has been a series of disappointments and suffering and failure. The commentator says he shares his dreams in chapter 37, his divine destiny, and then he gets thrown into a pit and sold to slavery by his brothers. He resists temptation and gets falsely accused by a beautiful woman, and then he's thrown into prison. And in our chapter, he helps another prisoner, the cupbearer, and at the end of the chapter, he gets forgotten. Hamilton, the commentator, says, here's a chain of 3 aggravating setbacks for Joseph. How would you handle if you were Joseph? If you lived the cycle of aggravating setbacks and you've been falsely in prison for 10 years, you're put in charge of the cupbearer and the baker, what would you do? Well, I don't know about you, but if I saw them, I think I'll be frustrated, I'll be self-concentrated, I'll be angry, I'll be slightly depressed. But in that moment of suffering, what does Joseph do? He sees 2 guys who had a dream, who've been in prison a lot less than he has, and he says, what's wrong? Why do you look so sad? Why so downcast? Think about that for a moment. It's an extraordinary act of grace. How is he still caring about other people? I mean, these 2 guys weren't in prison that long. They committed some big sin, probably against the king. They had these crazy dreams. They're freaked out. They're anxious. Along comes Joseph, who sees that they're a little bit troubled. Just looking at their facial expressions, he probably had a pastoral heart. He's priestly. He saw something in their face. Why do you look? He says, why do you look so downcast? It's amazing that he would even care. Human empathy released the whole of what follows. Joseph's expression of concern, writes a commentator, leads to the prisoners opening up their hearts, sharing their dreams, and eventually leads to Joseph's own freedom and promotion within the political ranks of Egypt. God, friends, used one everyday moment of care to continue his plan of salvation. Friends, you've had moments like this, haven't you? At least I've had. You go and you see somebody and you say, hey, everything okay? You think it's a passing comment. But that one moment of care, that one question opens up a floodgate of hurt and pain from somebody's life. And that brings a wide open opportunity for God's grace to bring a level of healing. That's why one of our core values here is counseling and community. We want conversations and openness to be like this. We want people to read the book that we give everyone as newcomers, written by Ed Welch, Side by Side, because it helps us practically to know how to ask questions like Joseph, to open up a floodgate for an opportunity of healing. Friend, the point is this. There are times even when your life is in the pits, but you're still called to care for people in some small way, in some small moment, with small questions. Why do you look so downcast? Even in the moment of your suffering, what helps you get through is to be other-centered and to still follow God's commandment to love other people, at least in small moments, with small questions, and in small ways. Why do you look so downcast? Because small questions in the right moment can bring about extraordinary change. That's what we see here. And it doesn't mean that you can't feel the hurt of your life. And it doesn't mean that you can't resonate with the pain that you're going through. But in small and certain moments, you are still called to care and to love people by the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ for you. That's life in the pits. Julie Lowe, a counselor, has said this, and I quote, "There's immense benefit to focusing on the needs of others. We all need to see the world outside of ourselves, a world that needs our care. To find satisfaction in caring well for others is deeply rewarding. It is loving others in ways that image Christ and makes him known." That's life in the pits. I once read a story of a seminary professor who went into deep depression. He was also a pastor, and his depression was so deep because he didn't care about anyone or anything, completely self-absorbed, completely self-concentrated. And the story goes is that he came into depression because he felt like a failure. Relentless criticism by students as well as his congregation members. One after the other, he couldn't do anything right, and everything went to a point of hopelessness. And then a friend came along and challenged him to think of people in his life who had been a major help to him in life. And from that list of people that he can remember, to pick one of them and write them a letter expressing gratitude. The man thought about it for some time, and then the face of his old school teacher came to mind when he was a small boy, a school teacher who had instilled in him a love of literature and poetry and prose and reading, of everything. And as he thought about this teacher from years ago, he decided to write her a letter, and he wrote her a letter telling how she had inspired him for his love of books and received eventually a reply from his teacher, who's old and retired by now. And this is what the shaky handwriting of an old lady in her senior years writes to her old student who thanked her after about 50 years. And this is what she said: "When I read your letter, I was blinded with tears, for I remember you as a little kid in my class. You have warmed my old heart. I have taught school for 50 years, but yours is the first letter of thanks that I have ever received from a student. I shall cherish it until I die." Life in the pits. Every one of us is called to live and to apply in some way what this seminary professor, by the grace of Jesus, was able to do. To show a moment of care even when life seems to bear down on you. Before we go to our second point, friends, I just want to make a quick application, because some of us, on the one hand, I know you're going through a lot, but you feel that life is so miserable that it made you self-concentrated, and you can't think outside of yourself. And I'm not judging you. I'm not saying that's immature. I can resonate, but the gospel pulls us outside of ourselves, even in moments of suffering. Some of you are always just looking, who's reaching out to me? Who's asking me, why am I so downcast? Some of you are looking, why is nobody asking why my face looks troubled? And that's legitimate, that's understandable, but some of us may be looking like that and feeling like that far too long, for years at this point. But the gospel pulls us and say, even in those moments of hurt, you can flip the switch and out of the grace of Jesus to ask somebody else, why do you look so downcast? On the other hand, some of you are so successful and life is so good and everything's going so well in life that you forget people. That's why they say when you become successful and popular and rich, they say, don't forget the little people. And that's exactly what the cupbearer ironically did with Joseph. When he got freedom and got his job restored, he forgot Joseph. But some of us, life is so great, so coherent, so peaceful, so fabulous, this life in Orange County, that you don't think about the quote-unquote little people. So wherever you are on this spectrum, life in the pits means that essentially you are called to ask somebody in this church, in this world, why do you look so downcast? Because remember, an ordinary question in an ordinary moment could open up the gates for an extraordinary time of change and healing in somebody's life. And that's what the Gospel of Joseph tells us. And this leads to our second point. Not only actually was Joseph compassionate people, but he was faithful to God. And this is what I mean by this, because it sounds so generic, but notice in verse 8, he interprets the dreams accurately, but he gives God the credit. Verse 8 says this: "They said to him, 'We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them.' And Joseph said to them, 'Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me.'" Now the cupbearer tells his dreams and said, "There is a vine with 3 branches. It blossoms into grapes. He took the grapes, made juice, and then he put it into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph interprets it and says, 'You'll be free and you'll get your job restored to you.'" The baker hears this and says, "I want a favorable interpretation too." It's basically saying, you ever eat at a Chinese restaurant? You open up the first fortune cookie, you read it just for fun. It's a great fortune. You'll find love and happiness. And say, let me open up my fortune cookie, see what I get. That's basically what the baker is doing. He says, there are 3 cake baskets on my head. The best of the baked goods is on the 3rd basket, but all the birds are eating it, and I can't stop it. Joseph says, well, this is your interpretation. After 3 days, just like the cupbearer, he'll lift up your head, but you're going to be hanged. This is a jarring, rattling, anxiety-driven interpretation. One guy gets freedom and his job back, the other guy gets hanged. What would you do if you were the cupbearer? What would you do if you were the baker? That's how Joseph actually interpreted the dreams, and we see that he was absolutely right at the end of the chapter. But this is the point. Joseph was faithful even in the midst of suffering. He was called by God to be an interpreter, a prophet, a speaker of God's truth and revelation. He saw people hurting, and he still interpreted their dreams. He's serving them. He's speaking for God. In the midst of unjust imprisonment for 10 years, he's still faithful in what God has called him to do. And he still gives God the credit. That's a big moment, friends. Our culture is one in which we live in entitlement, one in which the luxuries have become basic needs. But Joseph here sees his place. He still serves faithfully. And what does he do? He still gives God the credit. Don't Interpretations belong to God? Well, I'm just his vessel, I'm his voice piece. Tell me what the dreams are, I'll tell you what they say. He's doing this year in and year out, even when he's living, according to verse 15, life in the pits. And that means for us, friends, that you still have to live as a faithful student, as a faithful father, a faithful husband, a faithful mother and wife, a faithful worker, a faithful citizen. Now, you can't oscillate back and forth and be erratic, because if you do, then that's not faithfulness. He shows himself to be steadfast. It doesn't mean that Joseph wasn't hurting or had questions or was crying or that was deeply distressed, but it shows what the Bible records as his steadfastness, which is our lesson. Be faithful to God in the midst of brokenness. Friends, this story has a lot of details that are left out, especially details that modern readers like you and me want to know. What was the sin of the cupbearer and the baker? We don't know. What were their names? We don't know. Why was the cupbearer restored and the baker hanged? We don't know. What did the baker do? Who done it? It's like that movie Clue. What did he do? We don't know. The details are left out. Do you know why? Because that's not the author's point. The point of the chapter is not to give you the details to satisfy your curiosity. The point of the passage is to say, in the pressure cooker of life, what we see people being pressed on, we'll see what they're really made of. Joseph shows that in the pressure cooker of the pit, what the pressured life brings out of Joseph, what oozes out of his life, is faithfulness and steadfastness, a continuation of serving God and people and showing care. And you're thinking, that's Joseph, but that's not me. I can never do that. But friends, if you look deeply in this passage, look carefully, you can do this like Joseph, because Joseph was able to do this not because he was strong or more faithful. He was able to do this because God was faithful to him. God was pursuing and strengthening him to allow him to care for people and allow Joseph to interpret dreams. In other words, Joseph was faithful to God in the everyday because God is faithful to Joseph in his providence at every moment. John Calvin has once said this about this passage. John Calvin said, God, before he opened the door for his servant's deliverance, entered into that very prison to sustain him with his very own strength. The reason you could be like Joseph is not because you have to be as smooth and gifted as Joseph. The point, as Calvin said, is that before God opened up the doors of prison, he entered into the prison and gave Joseph moments of grace. He showed evidence of his providence to say, I'm with you, Joseph. Think about it. God gave Joseph his abilities. God gave Joseph his gifts. God gave Joseph life. God gave Joseph imprisonment, but it wasn't literally in the pits. It was in house imprisonment, Potiphar's house. God gave a promotion in prison to Joseph, so he sent Joseph over to see the cupbearer and the baker. Did you know the cupbearer and baker, they're not the people in the kitchen. The cupbearer and the baker are prominent and powerful roles in the political system of Egypt. They were the people who were the personal assistants of Pharaoh. They had to taste the food and drink the wine to make sure that no one's poisoning the king. Now think about it. Their official role is to make sure the food and drink was okay, and yet they had a lot of influence because they had Pharaoh's ear. It was a prominent and powerful position. And God pursues Joseph in prison and says, I'll strengthen you and I'm going to promote you to oversee two of the most influential political figures in the Egyptian kingdom. God, before he opened the door of his servant's deliverance, entered into that very prison to sustain him with his very own strength. In other words, in the favor that God ordained Joseph to be shown by Potiphar, in the position and status that Joseph was given in charge of these important royal officials, God was giving Joseph tokens of his love, tokens of his concern for him, tokens that were drawing God close to Joseph in prison and saying to Joseph, even if the world has forgotten you, even if the brothers have delighted in rejecting you, I'm going to pursue you and I have a plan for you. That is what Joseph shows us. And friends, this is where we have to understand that in the life of your pit, God is still doing this to you as well. He's showing in providence that he's still giving you health. He's still giving you family and church and friends and the gospel. He's still giving you all the world that we live in by his grace. And God is showing you that even though you're suffering, and that you're hurting and life is not going according to your plan, he's pursuing you in every moment, in every second of this life, and he's sustaining you. And you're living exactly what John Calvin has said, that before he opens up the gates of deliverance of your very own pit, he has shown you the very grace and strength by entering into your life in the everyday moments of his providence. Friends, Genesis portrays Joseph as a real human here. Genesis chapter 40 pictures Joseph not in his integrity or his proficiency, but in his humility and his human frailty. He's completely at the mercy of God's sovereignty. At the same time, Joseph is fully active and he's fully intentional in all that he does. He doesn't give up and say that just because God's in control, what's the purpose of even trying? Why even bother? Why even try? This is hopeless. Joseph doesn't do that, but we see that he gives God everything that he has and he tries to be faithful. Joseph knows that God is sovereign, but he doesn't take a back seat and say, what's the purpose of suffering? Why even bother trying to live faithful when I can't control anything? We see Joseph still tries to move. He still tries to be faithful. He's fully and actively engaged in the details of his life. That's why he says to the cupbearer, I'm interpreting your dream, and he's savvy, and he says, when you're free, don't forget my name. Get me out of this. I was betrayed. I was stolen. I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. He's still trying to move and get out. He's not passive. He's not fatalistic. He's not nihilistic. Friends, this is the point. Joseph actively and faithfully engages the world. Even in the pit of his life, he doesn't give up. Now, these are fancy words, but they say in our day and age that we live oftentimes in what they say a nihilistic world. Nihilistic comes from the Latin word which means nothing. That basically says that when you look out in this world, you can't control anything. It's just simply meaningless. No inherent, coherent value innately in anything. No value in this world, especially morally. Nothing is right or wrong, so go ahead and do anything because you can't make sense of the tragedies and the brokenness of this world, in the injustice. Nihilistic, just nothing and meaninglessness. On the other hand, there's a view of a lot of people where either realize this or not, that's called fatalism. And this is really the accusation of Reformed people because they have such a strong view of sovereignty. Fatalism says everything's already set in a recipe formula. Life is going to happen exactly the way that it's happening, so we could be fatalistic. It's just fate. Can't change or control anything. So on the one hand, there's this life that says everything's meaningless. On the other hand, there's this life that says everything's predetermined, but you kind of come to the same conclusion if you believe in either worldview. And that conclusion is basically saying it's hopeless. Suffering's meaningless. Suffering can't be controlled in fatalism. It's hopeless. I can't control the illnesses in my life, the broken relationships that I have, the news that I see in the New York Times or the LA Times of all the tragedies, both foreign and local. Can't change anything. I don't see the purpose in this. That leads to hopelessness. And some of you doctors out there may know better than me. There's studies that share that fatalism and nihilism, people embrace these worldviews that could have a correlation to depression. Because depression says everything is absent, it's meaningless, it's purposeless, I even try. But the Bible and the story of Joseph speaks directly into this because we see that God is fully sovereign in everything, controls everything. But yet Joseph shows that he's fully active and he engages, and he's trying to move and to make things happen with the giftedness that God has blessed him with. It says there's purpose and there's meaning. There's a reason that I'm in this pit. There's a reason that I'm overseeing the cupbearer and the baker. There's a reason why I have the gift of interpretation. There's a reason why actually I'm able to say to the cupbearer, don't forget me. And if you know the story, the cupbearer forgets him, but then 2 years later, something clicks, and then he's free from prison. There's a reason for all this. There's a purpose and plan. There's a significance and value for your life. And so it is for you too. You may feel hopeless. You may feel that nothing can be changed. But God is sovereign over this life, and he's calling you in your pit, in the life that you live, to be faithful to God and to serve and to actively engage and to be involved with all the grace that God has given you. And this leads us to our last point. Joseph showed that he had compassion for people, and he also showed that he is faithful in everyday moments to God. But last but not least, how do you live life in the pits? You have to deal with the fact that you're going to be forgotten. As sad as that sounds. Joseph interpreted the dreams. We see this in verses 20 to 23. Joseph was right. He interpreted them correctly. After 3 days, the cupbearer was given his job back, and the baker was executed and hanged. At the end of the chapter, it ends on such a down note. In verse 23, this is how the story ends. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Now, he writes it there twice in verse 23. For emphasis, he forgot him twice. He didn't remember Joseph, and he forgot him. It ends on a down note. Now, it's a weird, wild story. It's a remarkable story for the movies. And how does it end? Joseph was right. He was righteous. He was faithful. He had compassion for people. And then he was forgotten at the end. Joseph, by all that we could tell, was okay with this. See, we have the luxury of knowing right away what happened because it's written in the book for us and we're reading history. But if you're Joseph and imagine yourself to be Joseph in house imprisonment for 10 years, you're going to be free. You're going to be restored back to political power and might. Hey, can you do me a favor? When you're out and you're talking to Pharaoh and you have influence in the king's ear, can you let him know that I've been falsely imprisoned? Remember my name. My name is Joseph. Can you remember me? Let him know. What do you do after that if you're Joseph in prison? You're just waiting around. And it's not waiting for a text. Sometimes you text people or you want a Facebook message or see somebody likes your Instagram. You're just waiting, you're checking, you're addicted to social media. It's not like that. It's like you got to wait around in prison, waiting for a messenger, waiting for a note, waiting for someone to knock on the door, just having a moment after moment in anticipation to say, did the cupbearer remember my name? And nothing. He was forgotten. What would you do? I think I would go mad. But that's not what Joseph does, at least according to what we see here. Even in chapter 41, 2 years later, he's still faithful because he interprets 2 dreams for Pharaoh. He eventually gets out. I would be frustrated, but we don't get a sense of Joseph's emotions. No, he's human, so he probably could have been frustrated. Maybe he was struggling. We don't know, because what's written in the Bible is to emphasize the grace of God in Joseph's life. And what did Joseph do? All we see is his actions. He was compassionate and that he was faithful. What's missing is that he never seems to lose his temper. What's missing is that he never seems to complain. He never seems to grumble. After 2 years of freeing the cupbearer, there's no sense that he's losing his temper, he's complaining. There's no sense that he feels entitled. He doesn't grumble. He just seems to continue to be faithful. Friends, if we're honest here today, a lesson we can learn here by the gospel of Jesus Christ is that we are professional complainers and whiners and grumblers. We live in a culture of discontentment and complaining. The one pastor wrote it this way. He says, our culture cultivates discontentment and entitlement. He says, our society cultivates discontentment. We're always unhappy. Consistently, we hear a message of want. Mass media and advertising, holiday seasons, all capitalize on the misconception of necessity and the hungering for more. They are quite literally thousands of images and commercials, marketing ploys that are meant to create a sense of need. I need this new phone. I need this new gadget, this new product, this new article of clothing. I need this, although they're all luxuries. Advertising helps people feel a level of deficiency within our heart. It seeks to convince us that without the latest beauty product, invention, or gadget, we are lacking in life, and more importantly, we are lacking as a person. That's what it's trying to tell us. And secondly, this person writes, discontentment is easily triggered because our culture cultivates a culture of entitlement. We believe that we are inherently deserving of privileges and special treatment. I deserve that new electronic device or vacation. I deserve peace and quiet after a long day's work in traffic, and I come home and I don't want to hear the kids cry and complain. Peace and quiet is what I deserve because I'm good, and I deserve this because I work hard. Entitlement justifies whatever self-focused response pours out of my mouth in action. Entitled desires quickly become demands on people that excuse putting myself first and the needs of others last. That's our culture. Julie Lowe again says this: our culture may be like this, but the world of Joseph in our life is about God. She says life is about who God is, not what we own, not our possessions. His presence is always the answer to every need, every fear, and every suffering. This is true not because it removes the challenges of life or gives us what we want, but because it gives us perspective. Joseph told the cupbearer, "Remember my name," and he was forgotten. The reason he didn't break is because exactly what Julie Lowe says: the presence of God is the most important reality, and he had perspective even when he was living life in the pits. Joseph never got all the answers to his suffering, but I said when we began this series that Joseph got the most important answer, and that was that God was with him. Genesis 39. The Lord was with him. The Lord is with him. Joseph came out through suffering, and I would have asked, God, why did you put me through hell? Why did you do this? Why did you break my family? Why did you make me wait for 12, 13 years in prison? Why did you do this? Entitled and frustrated and angry, but Joseph doesn't do this because God didn't give him every answer, but he gives you and me the most important answer in your life in the pits. The Lord is with you. In his presence is power to fulfill every need and fear and suffering. He's with you. That's the perspective of life that we need. Friends, did you know that people in power and kings of the universe, kings never pursue people? Isn't that true? Kings never pursue people. Kings summon people. Kings receive people. Kings send other people to bring people to them. Kings never pursue people. Until you come to this one guy, his name is King Jesus, the King of the universe. And he's the only one who is the king in perfect power who pursues people, but it's not people of power or people of prestige or people of money. He pursues people who are broken and sinful. He pursues people who are beggars and poor. He pursues people who are rich and powerful. He pursues those who are self-righteous. He pursues those who are victims. And we see this throughout the Bible, that after Adam and Eve in Genesis has committed sin, God pursued them and said, don't worry, I'm going to enter a different relationship, the covenant of grace, and from the seed of the woman, there will be a man, his name is Jesus, that will crush the head of the serpent. And then he hears the cry of the Israelites through Moses, which is the story after Joseph. The Israelites are crying out of pain, and God hears them, and he pursues his people and says, I'm going to send you Moses. Moses, who will be a type of Christ that leads them out through the Exodus. And we see these wonderful romantic stories. We see that God, personified in Hosea, pursues Gomer, who's a prostitute, personifying you and me. And Gomer, and Hosea, is always pursuing Gomer. This is all to show that at the end of the day, that even in the story of Joseph, God pursues him in his providence, even in imprisonment and life in the pits. Places him and promotes him, gives him grace, gives him gifts, gives him the ability to interpret, trains him and sanctifies him in the moment of suffering. God shows in the everyday moments he pursues Joseph, and it points to the reality that God ultimately pursues you because he sends his son Jesus, the King, who doesn't beckon us on our performance of morality to say, God, I can come to King Jesus based on how good I am and my morality, my achievements. God sends Jesus, who out of utter grace and love and compassion is the true and better Joseph, and he enters into this world. And he pursues us not from the throne room of the kingdom, but he pursues us from the throne room of the heavenly kingdom of the universe. And he comes down, and he's born in a manger, and he takes on our flesh, and identifies with our sin. He pursues us not just to take us away, but he pursues us by identifying in every temptation and hurt and pain of your life in the pit today. And he saves us and redeems us, and then he brings us out of that in his resurrection so that we can know that we have the full spirit of Jesus within us, to know that God loves us and is compassionate and has given us every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. King Jesus has pursued you to the depths of hell as he died on the cross, and he pursued you to the heights of heaven as he was resurrected on the third day. And by faith, we walked out with Jesus and we made that tomb empty because of the King who is willing to pursue you and me in our sin. And that's King Jesus for us. So friends, when your life in the pits here today, and I know that many of you are, I pray that you'll look to Jesus, the King who has pursued you, that you'll turn your eyes upon the King who has loved you in his perfection, and to look full in the royal face of King Jesus, to look in his eyes and to look in his face so that the world will grow strangely dim. And we'll see that the King of the universe, who has perfection and power, has came down into this world to love you and me. Let us turn to the Lord. Let us pray at this time.